When David and I started Bandwidth, we wanted to be really intentional about our corporate cultures. Back in 1999, it was all about corporate culture back then. It was a time when the United States was moving to wearing a suit and tie to work every day to wearing t-shirt and jeans and flip-flops. And so we wanted to also be intentional about culture, which is what everybody was talking about. And I remember getting together and having dinner with David and talking about, well, what would our culture look like? And he said, if we're gonna have a corporate culture, it needs to mirror who we wanna be as individuals. It needs to be those values that are important to us. And those are faith first, then family, then work, and then fitness. Work is super important for us, but it's one of 4 things that we're called to do. On the fitness side, we have just a little bit more than 1,000 employees now, and almost 2/3 of them work out every day. Super important for us. It's not as important to us as our work. When we work, we feel God's pleasure. But then work in itself is not as important as our family. We have 9 kids between us, and it's important to be there for bedtime and bath time, story time. And then one night, it's a chance for us to take our wives out and let them know that indeed they're more important to us than our work. Then of course, the most important thing for us is our faith. It's impossible to spend any time with us and not understand the why of what we do. And we try to do that with gentleness and respect. When we go out on date night and when we see our kids play soccer games, we are able to show by example what it looks like to have many other things that are going on in our lives that are just as important, or in this case, more important than our work. Let's watch this video on this company that does a super job at encouraging values that love on their employees and their community.
To be honest, when I left, I said I never want to work in consulting ever again. Always on the road, no saying where you go, no saying how long you get to stay there. There was a lot of people, myself included, who didn't want the strapping of that lifestyle, the traditional consulting lifestyle. And so Point B began as a way to solve that.
It really started with putting people at the center. And we said, everyone at our firm has intrinsic worth and value. We genuinely cared about their life. And not just everyone in our firm, but whoever we come into contact with, they're all equally valuable in our eyes. And we meant that.
And so our founders really had this idea of, hey, we could provide the same results to our clients. We could solve the same problems that our clients have, but we could also create an experience for our people that takes care of them too.
Give me a sense of what consultancy was like back then.
Well, consulting, you got to remember that in the early days, go back to say the mid-90s, early mid-90s, consulting was run like a machine. Big firms essentially used people as their means of production, and they produced deliverables for their clients. So the people were the machines, and they ran them like machines. I was working sometimes well over 100 hours a week, and I really had no life.
What was the shift for you?
So I kind of made that choice. I made that, or actually came to the conclusion that consulting wasn't going to allow me to have the life I wanted to have. So I thought, well, instead of taking care of a client, let's take care of the people in our firm, and then in turn let them take care of clients.
How long have you worked at Point B?
I've been at Point B 19 years.
Why have you stayed here for 19 years? What's kept you personally here?
The opportunities for me to contribute to the business, to help clients solve their problems, to chart a course for myself that allowed me to follow my passions was really something that I hadn't experienced before, certainly in other organizations that I've been involved with. But also, I had just been at Point B for maybe less than a year. And my oldest son is an adopted son, and he came with a lot of special needs. And the way Point B embraced kind of this new big step in my life. After not knowing me for very long, really, was really significant.
Instead of asking people to commit everything to the firm and then hopefully leave the scraps for the rest of their life, we asked them to commit everything to their lives and just give us what you can give. We wanted them to have the life they wanted to live and wrap Point B around it, not vice versa. Not that we don't care about clients, but really our job is to take care of people. as we got going and things were starting to be successful at Point B, I get a lot of compliments. Hey, wow, you built such an incredible company, and you're such genius to figure out all these cultural things. And we actually, some of the things we did are now standard practice in the industry. But it wasn't genius. I mean, we borrowed it from, the Bible, but we never really brought that out. We didn't call it Christian. We just said, hey, here's the way we treat each other. This is just the way that we operate. We were probably about 10 years in, we started to realize that this thing had legs and was going to be around for a while, but we also started to wonder, how in the world are we ever going to exit this thing? And we were getting asked by our employees, are you guys going to own this, the three of you going to own this forever? Or are you going to sell out to some big firm and this whole thing's going to collapse when the big firm comes in and imposes their values? So we realized we needed to have an answer for them. So we looked at things like going public. We looked at being acquired by a larger firm. We looked at doing some financial, engineering. We looked at being purchased by a private equity firm, which is essentially a deferred acquisition.
I think their goal was to really think about how do we preserve the thing that we're proud of, the thing that we know works. And one of the best ways was to give it to the people who know the most about that.
I was pushing the ESOP option. ESOP is an employee stock ownership plan. I knew that was really the only way we could go because I think it was the only way that was going to be a win for everybody. And so ultimately we did settle on an ESOP.
And then it happened and here we were, ta-da, all of a sudden we're all owners. And we started to learn about what it meant to be an owner and really from then had our own journey of, well, what does it mean to be an employee owner? The longer you stay at Point B, the more your employee ownership shares grow. And it creates in people a longer-term view of why to stay that's not dependent upon necessarily wealth, but on the success of the business.
Ownership just seems intrinsically good. We always said we existed for the benefit of our people, and then when we became 100% ESOP owned, that was literally true.
Existing for the benefit of your people, that might feel at some other places in contrast with this singular goal of making a lot of money or looking at the bottom line. What Point B recognizes is that those are very closely intertwined. We talk about we don't make widgets, right? We have people. So if you're treating your people well, you're feeding them and nurturing them, and you're growing them as a person, then that in turn will lead to people delivering really great work, which then in turn is really how we make money.
Point B does exist for the benefit of its people. When we look at our billable hours, plan out what vacations are you going to take, what time off, what things are you going to do during the year ahead that are going to help you maintain work-life balance. We also say, hey, can I take this from you? Looks like you're overwhelmed. You're not in this alone.
You're not hung out there to dry on your own. Like, we got you, just like a family would. And when crisis happens or when beautiful things happen, we celebrate together and we mourn together. And we support you.
I'm a mom of a young kid, and I have been so supported by Point B through my journey into motherhood. We absolutely are supporting that whole life aspect.
If I were to generalize how we think about what we want for our employees at Point B, we want them to think like professionals, feel like they're part of a loving, supportive family, and then to act like a business owner. And that means we're not going to tell you absolutely everything that you should do. We're going to think that you know how to do some of those things yourself, and you can make your own decisions.
Faith does play into a lot of my relationships at Point B.
My faith gets expressed at work through service to the greater good, to the greater community.
We have conversations about how we bring our faith to work and how people show up for one another.
It's a team of people who care about each other. They care about the welfare not only of themselves, but of their clients. We all work to raise all boats. Like, it's not a zero-sum game. And to me, that's a real differentiator about Point B.
When people of faith approach business as a ministry field, business gets really exciting.
Point B is really a mission-based organization, helping every person find their purpose and live out how they were designed to be.
You know, I've heard Henry say that a lot of entrepreneurs got into the work that they do in order to find a sense of satisfaction, meaning, personal significance. But most of us eventually figure out that we can't find it there. But for many, by the time they realize that, the damage to their life has already been done. I want you to consider these statistics for a minute. Entrepreneurs are twice as likely to suffer from depression as ordinary people in our society. They're 6 times more likely to suffer from ADHD. They're 3 times more likely to suffer from substance abuse. They're 10 times more likely to suffer from bipolar disorder. They're twice as likely to have psychiatric hospitalization. They're twice as likely to have suicidal thoughts. There is a cost to placing your time, your energy, your efforts, your soul, the weight of your soul in one place. Entrepreneurship is an inherently lonely journey because you're the one who takes the risk. You're the one who puts your name on the line. You're the one who makes the decisions and you determine the values, you set the precedents. That's a lot of weight to sit on a person's shoulders. Well, I can't think of a more fitting book of the Bible to address this ongoing struggle than the book of Ecclesiastes. You know, the majority of the book of Ecclesiastes in the Older Testament is written by a man named Solomon, a man with seemingly endless wealth, wisdom, women, power, and a list of accomplishments that anybody would be proud of. The things that he invented, the new things he created in Israel were truly impressive. He explained in the book of Ecclesiastes that despite all of these things, life often felt for him like the Hebrew word he used was hevel. Hevel, that's a Hebrew word that literally means a vapor or smoke. It's like a cloud. It looks so solid and substantive from the outside. You remember when you were a kid and you looked up, you saw the clouds, and this looked like the kind of thing you'd want to bounce around in and play in. But then if you've ever passed through it in an airplane, you realize it's just vapor. It's nothing. If you were falling and you went through a cloud, you would go through it like it's not even there. It's just nothing. And Solomon said, that's what life felt like to me. It looked so substantive before I got there, and then I passed through it as if it was just a cloud like vapor. Solomon identifies 4 things in particular. He says that will disappoint us, that will fail us, even when we do them just right. He said, first of all, pleasure. Pleasure is going to disappoint you. In Ecclesiastes 2, verse 10, he said, whatever my eyes desired, I didn't keep from them. I kept my heart from no pleasure. Everything in Solomon's house was made of gold. He had the latest edition of everything. He was multi-talented. He was well-read. His kingdom was at peace. His business, so to speak, was surging. His power was unchallenged. He ate great food, and he had, scripture says, 1,000 wives. In addition to all this, he wrote New York Times best-selling books on just about every subject. He was one of the most popular songwriters of his day. He built the most impressive temple that the world had ever seen. He led Israel in a national spiritual revival. Again, that's a pretty good list of life accomplishments. Here's how Solomon concludes all that in the book of Ecclesiastes. Then I considered all that my hands had done and all the toil that I'd expended in doing it, and behold, all was hevel, all was useless. I'm like striving after the wind. There was nothing permanent to be gained under the sun. Pleasure has a way of leaving you hollow. I read an interview with the CEO in Forbes magazine, a CEO of a Fortune 500 company, who said, I spent my whole life climbing the ladder of success, only to find when I got to the top that it was leaning against the wrong building. Jim Carrey, the famous actor and comedian, he said, I feel like everybody ought to get rich and famous and do everything they ever dreamed of doing so they can see, like I have, that it's not really the answer. He said pleasure is going to ultimately disappoint you. He said the second thing Solomon said is sometimes even the best business wisdom, perfectly executed, will fail us. Here's what he says in Ecclesiastes. Again, I saw under the sun that the race doesn't always go to the swift. The battle doesn't always go to the strong. The bread to the wise, or riches to the discerning, or favor to the skillful. Rather, time and chance happen to all of them. Chapter 9, verse 11. Sometimes, in other words, you do everything right, and somebody less qualified succeeds. Or you just get unlucky, so to speak, or somebody stabs you in the back in a way that's unfair and you didn't see coming. Business wisdom is great, right? And we ought to devote ourselves to it, but it's not foolproof. It doesn't always work. And Solomon says, even that let me down. Number 3, he says, in the same way, worldly justice will eventually let us down. There's something meaningless that occurs in the justice systems on earth, and that is the righteous often get what the wicked deserve, and the wicked sometimes get what the righteous deserve. This too, Solomon says, I say, causes life to feel meaningless. Chapter 8, verse 14. Sometimes good, we know this, sometimes good goes unrewarded. And sometimes sin goes unpunished on this earth. And Solomon said worldly justice ends up disappointing us sometimes. Number 4, he said the fruit of our labor crumbles. Chapter 2, verse 18, Solomon said, I hated all my work that I labored at under the sun because I got to leave it to the one who comes after me. And who knows whether he will be wise or a fool, yet he will take over all my work that I labored at skillfully under the sun. This too is hevel, it's useless. In other words, man, I could spend my whole life building the greatest company the world's ever seen and the best values, and it's just built perfectly and it's profit making. And then I give my business to a fool, the successor that comes after me. We've seen that happen throughout history, haven't we? With kingdoms, with personal fortunes, sports teams, business succession plans. There's just no guarantees. So Solomon, after concluding that these 4 things are just not solid enough to build your life on and to make your anchor point, he says, how should you live? He says, first, you need to realize that you're created for God. St. Augustine said it so well 1,500 years ago. Our hearts are restless until they learn to find their rest in you. Satisfaction and meaning are just not found in success. Satisfaction and meaning are found in the approval that comes from obedience to the Almighty God. Second, Solomon says you need to arrange your life around the certainty of judgment. It is the height of folly, Solomon says in the last chapter of Ecclesiastes, not to live with the awareness that for each of us is appointed a time to die, and then after that, the judgment. Death and the judgment of God are 2 of the only absolute things in your life. That judgment could come for you this afternoon. It could come in 70 years, but come it will for all of us. You know, Blaise Pascal, the French philosopher, gave a really interesting picture of the human race one time. He said humanity is like a group that's in a party in a big room, and all of a sudden into the party, the doors open and a monster comes in and just grabs one person seemingly at random and mauls them and then drags their dead body out of the room. And everybody stops the party and watches this terrible scene and then just goes back to their frivolity. They're dancing and they're laughing and drinking and have a good time. But then a couple minutes later, it happens again. And everybody stops and watches, and then again. And every time after this horrific tragedy, they just go back to their frivolity. Eventually, you figure out the monster's coming back for everybody, but this doesn't distract the party. They stop in horror, but then they go back to their their messing around. And he said that monster represents our death, and we all know it's coming, but we live as if that's not true. And he said that's the height of folly, and that's basically what Solomon is saying in Ecclesiastes. The one thing you can be sure of is that you and I are going to stand before God. In light of that, Solomon says you ought to know how to count the days, right? And then you ought to think about how to make your days count. Number 3, he said you got to decide what God wants from you and pursue it. And that means being willing to take a chance on it. It doesn't mean it's guaranteed, but it means that when you figure out what God wants, you ought to go after that. He says in chapter 11, verse 4, one who watches the wind will not sow, and the one who looks at the clouds will not reap. In other words, you're trying to spend your life getting a guarantee, and you're just not going to get it. I don't care how much you pray or how spiritual you are. We just live in a world where there aren't these kinds of business guarantees. Here, what Solomon is saying, you got a farmer who never sows his seed because he's so scared the weather will not cooperate. What if it doesn't rain? What if there's a sandstorm? What if there's an earthquake? What if there's a meteor shower? Well, like we've seen throughout Ecclesiastes, the writer acknowledges that, no matter how spiritual you are, you can't control those things. And there's nothing in life that guarantees success. Not great skill, not careful planning, not even righteous living. You've got to embrace that. And chapter 11, verse 6, in the morning sow your seed, and at evening do not let your hand rest, because you don't know which will succeed, whether one or the other. In other words, don't let the uncertainty of life and the possibility of failure paralyze you. Just get busy doing what you think God wants you to do. In this life, nothing is guaranteed, even if you do it right. But risk is okay. Not all risk, not foolish risk, but some risk is right, and it's inevitable and it's wise. Sometimes an entrepreneur wants an ironclad divine promise of success. You're just not guaranteed that in this life. But that is not supposed to discourage you from taking those wise, well-calculated risks. Even in Jesus' parables, the characters that he tells the stories about are commended for taking risks. So live by wisdom. That's all you can do. And take appropriate risks and trust that God will take care of you in success or failure, because you've got a God that's bigger and better than success, but a God that's also stronger than any failure that you could encounter. Lastly, Solomon says, if you understand this, you'll seek happiness in the present, not the future. Solomon explains that we have a real temptation, especially entrepreneurs, to always try to find happiness out there. Oh, if I just get to that point, if we get that amount of revenue, then I'll be happy. But it's not out there, he says. Happiness, Solomon says, is a gift of God for the present. You should look for it now, not later. If you're not happy, it's not a problem with your circumstances or how much money you make or don't make. The problem is with your relationship with God right now. Again, the philosopher Blaise Pascal in his Pensée said that the tragedy of many successful people is they never actually learn to enjoy life because they're always living to enjoy it later. Here's how he says it. We never live, we only hope to live. We're always preparing to be happy, but we never actually are. And I will tell you that I have the privilege the last couple of years of serving as the president of the Southern Baptist Convention. And when that was offered to me a few years ago, my ambition kind of kicked in and I just really decided that, I wanted to do it. My wife looked at me and she said, I need you to understand that this is not going to make you any happier. It's in fact, if anything, it'll decrease your quality of life. She says, our happiness right now isn't found by how many people know your name or how successful you are. She said, the earthly quotient of our happiness is in the quality of your relationships with your family, in your church, with your friends. She said, had this great statement, fame is making yourself accessible to a bunch of people you don't really care about at the expense of those few that you do. And what she was trying to help me see, and she did help me see it, is that happiness is not something that comes from a certain accomplishment or getting my church to a certain size or selling a certain amount of books. Happiness is something that comes from the quality of the relationships I'm in right now, right? Even in earthly terms, Solomon says happiness comes from the present, not the quantity of exploits in the future. I point this out because I fear, and having seen this, that a lot of entrepreneurs look around at their lives many years later into the future and realize you gave away the greatest moments of your life to get some elusive future that just didn't deliver what it offered. The Apostle Paul says, godliness with contentment is great gain. The greatest gain that God can give you is not more stuff. The greatest gain that God can give you is contentment and the ability to enjoy what you have in the present. Alexander the Great is said to have died unhappy. The greatest conqueror that the world's ever known died unhappy, wishing for another world, he said, to conquer. John D. Rockefeller was asked at the height of his career, the height of his earnings, how much money is enough? What do you need to make life feel complete? And his answer very famously was, $1 more. You don't want that to be you. You don't want to, no matter what you accomplish, always feel like happiness and fulfillment is in the next kingdom that you got to conquer or the next dollar you got to make. That's a miserable way to live. The point is, be excellent at your work, but don't turn your work into a god. Don't serve your work, but use your work to serve God. And discovering how you can do that is where we're going to turn next.
What a great look at the life of Solomon, one of the greatest leaders of all time, who was effectively looking for happiness and peace and all the other things under the sun. And we know how that ended up. And that also makes me think a little bit, of course, about Matthew 6:33, about the concept of looking for happiness and joy in what we wear or what our stock price is or how much we're growing month over month. Our hope is that this is a session that helps you really think about what we are pursuing. And are we consumed by our work? Are we trying to earn our own salvation? Or are we finding peace and joy in our relationship with God first and foremost? Then out of that peace and joy, do we then come to the altar with all that we are, our experience and our giftings and our talents, and do we do it out of gratitude? Of course, we are not immune to this pursuit of joy and happiness in our lives and our businesses as well. So the question for us is, what's really powering us? Is it our relationship with God that brings us peace and joy that really helps to sustain us? Or are we suffering under this yoke that feels really, really heavy? Our hope is that you'll engage with us and that you'll engage with others, maybe in a small group, to talk about what does it look like to work for the glory of God and working out of a sense that there's this God who loves us so much that he sent his son. Please come to the website and check out our daily blog, our weekly podcast, our monthly newsletter. Interact with us. Tell us the things that you're struggling with work, faith, balance, and with money, all of those things. We're very grateful that you've tuned in for this, and we look forward to seeing you next time. Thank you.